Okay, it's recording.
So I'll back up a little bit and say, many years ago when my twin brother Howard and I were asked to speak to the General Services Administration here in downtown Atlanta, and before the event, they introduced us to a Marine general that had just flown in from Washington for the occasion. And he told us there's going to be 300 or more people in the audience, and a lot of them are going to be Marines. So what do you say when you know there's a lot of Marines in the audience? So I got up to speak, and I said, well, my twin brother and I, we graduated high school January, a little over a month after Pearl Harbor, January 1942, 17 years old. And I said we knew at some point we were going to have to go into the military, but we wanted to go right into college to try and get in as much college education as we could. So I said, well, we were born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida, big Navy town at the time, still is. And we didn't want to go in the Navy because we were afraid we'd get seasick. We didn't want to go in the Air Corps. We were afraid of heights. That left the Army and the Marines. Well, while we were willing to fight for our country, we were not anxious to die for our country, so we joined the Army instead of the Marines. So, of course, we got a standing ovation from all the Marines in the audience.
It was a compliment to them.
Well, I figured they would like to hear something like that.
Right. That's great.
But anyhow, you want to ask me the questions, or you want me just to give you the answers?
All right, so I'll ask a few. So, what is your name? Where were you born, and where did you grow up?
Okay, my name is Hilbert Margol.
All right.
Hillel. And I was born the elder of identical twin boys. By 10 minutes. I was 10 minutes older than my younger brother, Howard.
Oh, wow.
Born in Jacksonville, Florida, February 22nd, 1924. Happened to be George Washington's birthday. So we grew up in Jacksonville, and mainly, well, we were born in a house about a half a block from the synagogue, not in a hospital. And then they moved the synagogue, relocated to a different area of Jacksonville, area called Springfield. And of course, my family moved also to be near the new location of the synagogue. It was a mixed neighborhood. A heavily Jewish population, but a lot of our neighbors were not Jewish. Most of them were Southern Baptists, so to speak, and everybody got along. Of course, it was, followed by the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, and the early 1930s was strictly a Depression period, but everybody got along. And didn't matter what religion you followed, we were all just neighbors, and everybody knew everybody in the neighborhood. I remember when anybody in the neighborhood, a young man, a middle-aged man, got a job, it was cause for celebration in the whole neighborhood. So, pretty much it. Next question.
All right. So, I know you have a twin brother named Howard, and so tell me about your family, including Howard.
Well, we had an older brother. He was 3 years older than us. His name was Melvin. We had a younger sister. She was about 6 years younger than us. Her name was Bernice. She still lives in Tampa, Florida. And my sister Bernice and myself are the only remaining members of our immediate family.
I'm curious, what was your heritage? How did you end up in Jacksonville, Florida? Where was your family from originally?
Well, my father was born in Lithuania, a village, a shtetl called Pushalat. And he ended up going to one of the finest yeshivas in Europe. And when he was 15, 16 years old, there was no more education possibilities for him, but he had an older sister and an older brother that had relocated to London, England. So he left and went to London, and he lived with their families for about 2 years. So I guess he was 17, 18 years old when he was able to get sponsored. He had a cousin living in Connecticut, and he managed to get his cousin to sponsor him, able to get a visa to come to the United States. And he listed, I have a copy of the ship's manifest that my brother Howard obtained, because he became once he retired from our business many years ago, he became very interested in Jewish genealogy. So he was able to hire some research people in Lithuania to research our family history. And so that's how we learned our family history. But my father came to Connecticut, where his cousins had a farm, and through the grapevine, he learned that Jacksonville, Florida was looking for a Hebrew school teacher. Of course, my father was highly educated, so he wrote a letter, and they wrote a letter back, promised him certain things, so he got on a train and ended up in Jacksonville, Florida. Once he got there, what they had promised was a little different than what they were prepared. So he decided he wasn't going to do that. So he had a few dollars, and he met another man that also came from the same village, Pushalat.
Wow.
Name was Ben Setzer. And they formed a little partnership and got a wagon, and they went to the ice house and bought these large blocks of ice, and they had them cut up into individual blocks of ice. Those days we didn't have refrigerators. They were ice boxes. Somewhere in my files I have a picture, I must have been maybe 6, 7 years old, of me holding with large ice tongs one of those blocks of ice that they would deliver to the various homes to put in their ice boxes. That was his first business. From there he ended up getting ladies' clothing, buying ladies' clothing on his push cart and going around to neighborhoods selling ladies' dresses. And that's how he started a little business. And then he opened a small clothing store, ladies and men's clothing, in Jacksonville in the Black Business District. And if we wanted to see our father, except for Sundays, we would have to go to the store, either after school, and it was maybe 10 miles away. We didn't have a car. My father used to walk, so he would get up early in the morning while we were still sleeping to walk that distance to open the store.
Wow.
And then we woke up, we didn't see him, and when he came home after closing the store at 8, 9 o'clock at night and then walking back home, we were sleeping again.
Wow.
So that's why we only would see him on Sundays, except if we wanted to go to the store on our bicycles after school, or sometimes Saturday afternoons. that's pretty much the way we existed. So I think I've already answered your next question. How old were we when we got in the Army? Well, not quite. We went to the University of Florida. They had a ROTC program there, Reserves Officers Training Corps. And so we joined that. And so it was horse-drawn artillery. The horses were real. The howitzers were real, 105 millimeter howitzers. Our rifles were made out of wood. So much for being prepared for combat. But anyhow, so after, this was early 1942, and I guess it was early October of 42, an Army officer came and talked to the ROTC students and said, if we join an Army Reserve unit, there's a good chance they'll let you stay in college to finish your college. Sounded good. So my brother Howard and I, we signed up. October the 25th of 1942, we joined the Army Reserve unit. Well, early 1943, they called our reserve unit to active duty, but they allowed us to finish that semester. So April the 3rd of 1943, we reported to Camp Blanding, Florida for active duty. From there, they sent us to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 13 weeks of basic training. Again, as being trained as gunners on 105 millimeter howitzers, which is the same training we had at University of Florida. After 13 weeks, we were interviewed and offered the opportunity to go to officers training school. We said, well, what's that about? He said, well, in 3 months, you'll both come out as second lieutenants. In those days, they called them 90-day wonders.
Oh, I've heard of those.
So we looked at each other, thought about it, and said, well, if we do that, we come out both as second lieutenants, they're going to split us up. They're not going to let us stay together. And we were always very close throughout growing up. So what else is available? I said, well, the Army is just starting a brand new program, Army Specialized Training Program. If you go on that, they'll send you to some college to take courses in engineering. I said, well, going back to some college? Yeah, well, that sounds good to us. So we went, so they assigned us to the ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, and they sent us to, first was Syracuse University, Syracuse, New York. We were there, and we got to Syracuse probably in September, October of 1943, and we saw our first snow. We had never seen snow before in our life. So we saw our first snow in Syracuse, New York, and after 3 or 4 months there, they transferred us to University of Illinois, same thing, taking courses in engineering. And then after a few months there, some Army general in Washington decided they had thousands of young soldiers in colleges. And they said, no, we need them for combat. So they canceled the program, and that's when they split us up. They sent my brother Howard to the 104th Timberwolf Division, Mojave Desert in California, infantry. Here all the training was in the artillery, but they put him in the infantry in the Mojave Desert, training for the North African campaign. After a few months there, they decided they didn't need any more troops for the North African campaign, so they moved his division to Colorado, Pikes Peak area for mountain training, because they were planning an Italian campaign at the time. So here he was walking up and down Pikes Peak Mountains, carrying a 45-pound base plate for a mortar on his back, and leading a pack mule with the rest of the armament and the ammunition for this mortar. And he put in a transfer request to his captain, because by that time they had sent me to the 42nd Infantry Rainbow Division in Oklahoma. And when I got there, they also put me in the infantry. But after a couple of months, they decided I was in the wrong place, so they moved me over to the artillery. Once again, I was a gunner on a 105 millimeter where all my training was. Well, Howard ended up putting in 3 requests to be transferred to my outfit. He learned from the captain's orderly, top secret, because the orderly told him if he divulges what he's going to tell him to anybody, he could be court-martialed. So he told Howard the captain was just throwing his 3 requests in the trash can. So the next day, Howard went to his captain and said, "What's the status of my transfer request?" And the captain said, "My job is to train you, not transfer you," which Howard didn't understand the reason at the time. But as he found out later, the captain already knew that the 104th Division, this was after D-Day, so the 104th Division was going to be shipped direct to France, be the first division that was shipped direct to France from the U.S. Prior to that, they had to be shipped to England. But they were the first division. And the captain already knew that a few months away, and he didn't want to lose Howard, who was highly trained, to some kid fresh out of basic training that didn't have all the training. So anyhow, short time later, Howard sent a letter to our mother telling her what the situation was. So she was always a rather aggressive type person anyway. And she wrote a letter to President Roosevelt.
Oh, wow.
And a couple of weeks later, she got a letter back from the White House, not signed by President Roosevelt, but signed by his some general who was his military aide. And said, on orders of the president, as a 2-star mother, her request would be granted.
Wow.
But it didn't say who's going where. A couple of weeks later, she got another letter from the War Department basically saying the same thing. We still didn't know. Fortunately, she got a 3rd letter from the 104th Division headquarters saying that Howard was being transferred to my outfit. Cause for celebration. I had the original letter that I acquired many years ago when my mother was still living, which resides in the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Wow.
The 2nd letter and the 3rd letter, to this day, is in the possession of one of my nephews. For whatever reason, he refuses to part with it. So I was able to get him to send me copies, and I sent that to the museum. But something I learned, especially about the Holocaust Museum, I sent them the copies, and they said, well, they really don't want copies. They want originals, because copies can be changed.
Right.
Originals can't be changed. So I'm still working on that to this day. But at least I have the satisfaction of knowing that the original from the White House, because I have a copy of it on my computer, but they have the original in the Holocaust Museum. So that's how we ended up getting back together. Howard was transferred to my outfit. We had in our gun battery, which consisted of 100 men, we had 4 howitzers, 105 millimeters. Howard was a gunner on number 2. I was a gunner on number 3.
Oh.
And next question.
So, what were you doing when you got news that Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Well, I remember it. It was December 7th, 1941. Sunday. It was a Sunday. We had radios. TV was unknown at that time.
Yeah.
And we had most families had a radio. I remember it was Sunday, and President Roosevelt came on the radio and announced the attack on Pearl Harbor. And we were home, and everybody.
How old were you at that point?
17.
Okay, so you weren't going to get shipped off.
No, see, we were 17 until February 22nd of 1942.
Mm-hmm.
We became 18, and we were already in college at that time as freshmen.
Right.
Next question. You want me to just read it, or?
Go ahead and ask them.
Before the attack, what were your views on the war? Like, did you think that the U.S. should get involved or did you think that they should stay out of it? And also, did you have family still in Europe, and did that influence your view?
That was not something that occupied. We were 17 years old. We were very athletic, and before high school, even in the 9th grade, I was very interested in football. We played football, baseball, basketball, but I was more interested in football. I actually played, there was a Catholic high school, but the Catholic high school only had maybe 400 or 500 students. So they formed a football team, and they were looking for volunteers. So I heard about it, and I joined a Catholic football team when I was in the 9th grade. So that was the kind of things that was on my mind. Now, when we entered University of Florida, we had friends that already joined the Army or joined the military. We had one neighbor friend. He was 2 years older than us. He immediately joined the Army Air Corps and was accepted. Unfortunately, a year or so into training, he was killed in a training accident. That was as far as he got. So we had other friends, that we went to college, but there were others that instead of going to college, we had another friend, name was William Katz, and he went right into the military, into the Air Corps. We called him Kitty Cats. Was his nickname. We only knew him as Kitty Cats. But anyhow, he became a bomber pilot, U.S. B-17 bomber pilot. And after the war ended, he ended up in Israel and was one of the first Israeli pilots in Israel. And that was another whole story. I could spend a lot of time about his experience and how we met in Israel and so forth. But I'll say that for another day.
You're going to need to keep moving a little bit, Radley, if you want to get through
skip
them.
over a few of
Pick some of the
few
more important
questions.
ones.
Where did you serve, and what was that place like?
Well, we were in Oklahoma. We finished our training and boarded troop trains. It just so happened the Battle of the Bulge broke out. They took our infantry units, the 3 infantry regiments in the division, they rushed them right over, and they got in. They entered the last couple of days of the Battle of the Bulge. And then they put them, when that ended, they put them in what they said was a quiet area because they had no support. The rest of the division, we were on our way to France, but they had no support. I think they got a few tanks for support from one of the other outfits, and the quiet area turned out to be, they didn't know it, Army intelligence wasn't aware of it, but Hitler decided after the Battle of the Bulge he was going to try one more offensive right where our infantry companies were. And they were ordered, they got casualties, killed, wounded, captured, but they were ordered, one of the regiments, the 232nd, was ordered to hold the ground at all costs, which they did. They got a presidential unit citation for doing what they did. But you never know how events, you can refer to them as luck, or bad luck, or good luck, affected other soldiers, other people. And what that did, when we arrived and we left the New York harbor, we disembarked in Marseille, France, and by that time the combat was some hundreds of miles north of Marseille, France. Well, we couldn't go into combat right away, although we were ready, because our infantry companies, the 3 regiments, were getting replacements for their losses. Well, the replacements had to get some kind of training, especially some of the officers that were lost on working. We were in direct support of the 222nd Infantry Company. So they had to get experience of working together because we were always right behind the infantry 222nd Regiment in combat. So we went on the French countryside like maneuvers like we were in Oklahoma. So they could get training, especially we had 2 forward observers that were with, one was on the ground with the infantry, 2nd Lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, to call back on the radio, giving us fire commands at different targets. The other forward observer was also fresh out of West Point. He flew a Piper Cub airplane over enemy lines. He would radio back different targets. And that's how we got our fire commands to fire our howitzers. So here we're going on maneuvers maybe a week, 10 days, a little longer during this training period. And one night, maybe 11:30 at night, we got orders to pull over into an area, dig in our howitzers. We thought it was just more training. So we dug in our howitzers, put our camouflage nets over the howitzers, dug foxholes. This is all we were ordered to do. And at the first light the next morning, suddenly shells started firing over our heads. Said, well, this must be the real thing. It's no more practice. It took us 2 or 3 days. You could learn. Well, we learned the next day. We were dug in a town called Village Sormoda. It's on the Moda River. They called it a river. To us, it was like a creek in this country, a wide creek, not really a fast-moving river. We were dug in on one side of this Moda River, Wingen Sormoda, the village of Wingen, which was located on the Moda River, Wingen Sormoda. And the Germans on the other side of the river was what the locals called a mountain. We called it a very high hill. The Germans were dug in on the other side. So the Germans start firing shells over our heads at targets behind us. Our 155 millimeters howitzers behind us, and the 240 millimeter howitzers behind them, they were firing over behind the German lines. It took 2 or 3 days. You could determine by the difference in the sound which shells were going behind us and which shells were being fired to the Germans. There's a little difference in the sounds, and you could pick that up. So, because they weren't all firing necessarily at the same time in combat, and then from there we moved on further north. But during the about 4.5 months we were actually in full-blown combat, we were always within a few feet or a few yards of our howitzer. We had our sleeping bags. Didn't matter what the weather was, whether it was rain, sleet, snow, you name it, cold, because we could get fire missions at any time during the day or night. So we had to stay right there and be ready as soon as the telephone rang. We would have to spring into action, figuring the odds are it's another fire mission. There was a rare time when that field telephone rang that it wasn't a fire mission. So we heard that field telephone ring. If it was at night and we were sleeping in our sleeping bags, the first ones that woke up would wake up the other guys. Each howitzer consisted of 10 men. You had a sergeant, a corporal, a gunner, and the other 7 men were preparing the ammunition. And everything worked like clockwork. We were overtrained, if anything. We could do everything in our sleep if we had to, including taking our carbine rifles apart and putting them back together again, because we did that blindfolded in training. Now, what do you do in combat in those kind of situations? You got to go to the bathroom. Okay, what do? One incident in particular stands out in my memory. I had to go one morning to the back, relieve myself. You dig a small hole. You first walk away from the gun, maybe 40, 50 feet away. You dig a hole. You drop your trousers, squat down to relieve yourself. Well, that was the position I found myself in that morning. And in training in Oklahoma, we were trained to recognize the silhouettes of every airplane, Allied planes and German planes. So we could tell the different type airplanes and whether they were Allied planes or German planes flying over. Well, we also received the silhouette of the German jet plane. The Germans were the first ones to have jet aircraft, jet fighter planes. We were also told that they were not very maneuverable. They could fly very fast in straight lines, but not very maneuverable. So this is the position I'm in, and suddenly I'll look up, and here comes this German jet fighter plane. Looks like he's coming straight towards me. He's in a strafing position. Look up, it all happens in seconds. 1 second I thought I could reach up and shake hands with the pilot. It wasn't that close, but it seemed that close. Fortunately, he was going after targets behind me. It happens, and it's all over very quick. I can tell you, that incident, that sight, helped relieve me.
No. Yeah, you finished quickly.
So, but anyhow, you go through combat and all that time. We had C rations and K rations to eat, so we never lacked for something to eat because they came in individual boxes. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You had different kind of cans of different food, a little package of 4 cigarettes, a little package of a little small, very hard chocolate candy bar. That was it. So my brother and I never smoked. I say never smoked. We did smoke on one of our father's King Edward cigars when we were maybe 9 years old. We went in the garage and we each took a cigar and lit up. And I think we first turned green, then we turned purple. And we said, boy, if this is what smoking's all about, it's not for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we never smoked after that. That took care of that.
Yeah.
Next question.
Did you make any friends in the Army?
Well, friends in the Army. When we joined active military duty, especially basic training, and then from there, you make a lot of friends in basic training. They're from all over the United States. Some you get more friendly with than others. But then 13 weeks later, you're all being shipped out in different directions. Mm-hmm. So you start all over again, making friends. Then, some months later, you shipped out again. As I mentioned, Howard to Mojave Desert, mm-hmm. and me to Oklahoma. You start all over again, making friends. Who do you trust? That's the reason we wanted to stay together, because we knew whatever happened, if we were together, at least we each had one person we could depend on regardless of what happened. We could trust them. Otherwise, it's not, until you get very acquainted with your fellow soldiers, you don't know who to trust. You don't know their backgrounds. In fact, our captain, we found out his Jeep driver had served prison time. I don't know what for, but we all decided the captain must have selected him as his Jeep driver, figuring he served prison time, he must be a tough guy to go into combat with. But you don't know people like that. So, next question.
Did you witness anything inspiring during the war?
I didn't get that one.
Did you witness anything inspiring during the war that inspired you?
Oh, yes. Well, there were things that happened. We crossed the Rhine River into Germany, and the first town was called Dahn, D-A-H-N, Dahn, Germany. Now, let me set the scene. In combat, we never set up our howitzers inside any village, city, or town, because that's where the infantry guys were just ahead of us. We were always on the outskirts, set up our guns to fire at targets that were impeding the advance of the infantry guys. So sometimes the targets would be inside a city where German snipers, whatever. And so we were always, and depending on the situation and the terrain, sometimes our four howitzers, were quite a distance apart, spread out. Other times they were somewhat closer together. So, Dahn, Germany. Once Dahn was under control, Germans were all cleaned out, retreating. Our division was given a 2-day rest period. One of our division chaplains was Rabbi Eli Bonin from Providence, Rhode Island. And he was a favorite of our commanding general, General Harry Collins. So Rabbi Bonin, Chaplain Bonin, went to General Collins and said he just looked at his Jewish calendar, and the next evening would be the first night of Passover. He would like, if possible, to have some kind of Seder. Well, General Collins, being the person that he was, liked the idea. He was always a showman. Walter Winchell gave him the nickname of Hollywood Harry. So he sent Rabbi Bonin and his assistant jeep driver, whose first name also was Eli, back to France with a couple of trucks. And they got a hold of the Jewish agency in France, and they got freshly killed chickens and vegetables, French wine, and Rabbi Bonin was able to get a small Haggadah. And they came back to Don, and we had a Seder that next evening. It was in a old schoolhouse where at one time during the war the Germans had set that up as some sort of, they used that schoolhouse as a command headquarters. So they found, the rabbi had this small Haggadah, he wanted to make copies. So they went looking, they found a mimeograph machine, but it was dirty, dusty. So then they went looking for some rags to clean it. All they could find was 2 Nazi flags. That's what they used to clean that mimeograph machine. And they printed out 800 copies.
Wow.
My brother Howard brought his copy home with him. He ended up donating it to the museum, Jewish museum here in Atlanta.
The Bremen, yeah. Is it the Bremen Museum?
Yeah, the Bremen Museum is where it rests in their archives.
So there were 800 men that participated in that Seder?
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
Close to 800 men.
Yeah.
Well, they issued orders for all Jewish soldiers, that were with other units around within a 40, 50 mile radius that were interested in coming there. So we actually had a Seder. Now, it just so happened, through coincidence, some months ago, I obtained an original copy of that little Haggadah. So I won't go into all the details, which is also another interesting story. But Sue Verhoff, who is in charge at the Atlanta History Center, her and I have had a number of contacts over the years. But she told me something, Veterans Day event, that she remembered 2 stories that when they interviewed my brother Howard in 2014 at the History Center, interviewed me there 2016, she said there were 2 events that he and I spoke about that she's never forgotten. One of them was about a Passover Seder in Germany, and the other one was about transporting survivors, Holocaust survivors in Austria. And I couldn't believe she remembered both of those events. So I said, well, it just so happened I just received an original Haggadah. She said, oh, do you want to part with it? And I said, well, my intention is to donate it to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, because I've already contacted them and they don't have that. So she said, well, could you give it to me? And so we could make a high resolution copy of it. Certainly. She said it was in no hurry, because she wants to have it. They have some kind of event when Easter Passover starts just before Easter, and she would like to present it at that time, a high resolution copy. So as we speak, it's in the process, because they've already made arrangements in contact with the Holocaust Museum in Washington that once they do this, which it could have happened yesterday, I don't know, then they're going to ship the original to Washington. That's where it'll end up.
Cool. I have a question about the Seder.
Yeah.
So, how did they have lamb shanks? Did they have moror and did they do was it a full seder or was it just a?
They even had some matzah that they acquired somehow in France.
Wow.
Wow.
But the main thing, I have some pictures of, because there wasn't a room large enough to accommodate everybody.
Right.
So we were split up in hallways and rooms and whatnot. And the General Collins was there. The Assistant Division Commander, General Henning Linden, was there.
And those don't sound like Jewish names, so I guess they just were there to oversee what they had agreed to.
Well, General Collins was there to speak and welcome the soldiers. And what I have, the pictures that I have, and the letter that's on the Haggadah, the cover of the Haggadah is a letter that General Collins wrote, and his remarks. I have all that in my computer, but and when I go to the Weber High School, I speak there twice a year, and Rabbi Sokol, the teacher, makes sure that I bring up that Seder.
That's neat.
Because he has the pictures that I sent him all in his computer, and he shows it on the screen. But so that was the first incident that brought back memories. And at the time, we felt it was a history-making event for the first Seder to be held inside Germany
Right.
in a number of years.
What year was that Seder? Do you remember?
That was March, I think it was March the 25th of 1945.
Wow.
And one incident, they had announced that, and that was the only time we were actually inside Don, Germany. We were not inside Don, Germany during combat, but we were inside for the Seder. But they had announced that they were going to have a shower crew come there, and those that would come earlier could take a hot shower if they wanted to. Well, I jumped at the chance. Howard did too, because we hadn't had a bath. We used to, how do you shave?
Right.
How do you wash around, especially at cold temperatures? Well, you manage. But anyhow, we had cans of Sterno we carried on the truck to heat hot water in our steel helmets. So they had a shower unit set up, and the shower stalls were like porta potties. And they had the equipment. They piped water out of a nearby stream, and the water would be piped out of the stream, go through some water purification equipment, and then into the shower unit, a heater unit, and so then you would turn the shower on and get warm water. So I showered. They gave you a towel and a small bar of soap. Now I'm all soaped up. Now I'm ready to turn the water back on to shower off. So in the middle of the warm water coming out, suddenly sand starts coming out. The equipment malfunctioned.
Oh no.
Now I'm covered with sand.
You can't wash off.
So what do? You take the towel and you just towel as much as you can. So much for a nice hot shower. Put your uniform back on and you're ready for the safe.
With a little extra sand in your uniform.
The next event, after Würzburg, Nuremberg, the next military objective was Munich. So very, very early Sunday morning, April the 29th, 1945, we're on a 2-lane country road. We got orders to stop, pull over on the right side of the road. It's a wooded area. On both sides of the road were woods. On the right side was just enough of a clearing to accommodate our 4 howitzers. that was the closest our 4 howitzers had ever been together. I mean, we could almost touch each other. They were that close. Couldn't be any closer. So we had some fire missions. Everybody smelled a very strong odor. Couldn't help it. One of our Jeep drivers, I remember, came by and he said, on the left side of the woods, there must be a chemical factory over there to account for that strong odor. My twin brother Howard came over to me and he said, he don't think it's a chemical factory. He doubts it. He said the odor reminds him when we were kids and our mother would go to a kosher meat market and buy a freshly killed chicken. She would take it home. Those days you had to buy the whole chicken. You couldn't buy just parts like you can today. Take it home, hold it over the gas flame of the stove in the kitchen to burn off any remaining pin feathers. In so doing, it would burn the skin and some of the fat of the chicken. He said that's the odor that it reminds him of. So I asked my gun sergeant permission, could Howard and I go over and locate the source of this strong odor? He said, okay, go ahead, but don't delay because we don't know. We had a lot of fire missions, but then it was a quiet period. He said, we don't know how long we're going to be here. We could get orders to pull out at any time. I said, okay, so we walked through the woods. First thing we saw, maybe 10, 15 minutes later, was a line of railroad boxcars. We crawled over between 2 of the boxcars. When we got on the other side, we looked to our right, and there was an open boxcar filled with dead bodies. You could tell by the striped uniforms they had on, clothing they had on. They were all Jewish. And there were other boxcars we saw also open, a few more. We didn't know what we were seeing. We didn't understand. We saw what we saw, but we didn't understand what it was about. We had a little Brownie box camera that we had liberated a couple of weeks earlier. We knew the only film we had was what was inside the camera. So how many exposures do you have?
Right.
So we weren't anxious to take pictures, but we took a picture of that one boxcar because what was unique about it was one leg was hanging out, dangling out of the boxcar. The other boxcars we saw, no limbs were hanging out. They were all inside. So we took a picture of that one. And then we noticed some soldiers going through. There was a building there nearby and going through a gate. So we just followed them inside the
American
gate.
soldiers?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we followed, they were from Rainbow Division,
Right.
infantry guys. And we followed them into the gate and went in, we looked around. It was a large open area. And then some buildings, a lot of barracks buildings. Everything was quiet. We didn't see anything except other soldiers. What are we looking at? What are we seeing? We didn't know. So knew we couldn't stay there very long. We saw different places. We saw piles of dead bodies. We didn't understand. What are these dead bodies doing?
They were wearing same stripe.
For the most part.
Yeah.
Not all, but for the most part. So what is this all about? Because we didn't know. We heard about concentration camps, but that's all we knew. We didn't know details. In Oklahoma, we had a movie once a week. We had a movie. Well, you go to the movie. What happened before the movie starts? It was the same way before we even graduated high school. The war was going on at the time in Europe. Fox Movie Tone News would come on. What were they showing? Combat pictures. They weren't showing pictures of concentration
Right.
camps or anything like that, so we didn't know. But anyhow, so we left. We knew we couldn't stay long, so we turned around and went back to our unit just in time, because maybe 10 minutes later we got orders to pull out. Now,
Do you remember what the date was then, or the
the
time?
date,
Yeah.
it was Sunday, April 29th, 1945.
That's around when Dachau was liberated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the day of liberation. We were there early that morning. As we found out later, the official surrender didn't take place till about 2:30 that afternoon.
I was gonna say I knew that.
But we were there early that morning.
You remember the dates really well. How are you remembering these dates so well?
Well, first of all, I remember because what I saw sticks in your mind.
Right.
You can't escape it. How did we know after we left to head towards Munich that we were 8 to 10 miles north of Munich?
Mm-hmm.
Because the road sign had signs on it. 1 hour pointing to Munich. It was in kilometers. But we knew how to convert kilometers into miles. We knew we were 9 miles north of Munich. Then there was one sign that said Dachau, the town of Dachau, not the concentration camp. So that's how we connected up. We said, wait a minute, that camp we went into must have been at Dachau.
Mm-hmm.
This was after the war ended.
Mm-hmm.
Had to be, because we were at the village of Dachau.
Yeah.
And of course, as it turned out, in my presentation, which you saw Sunday morning, right?
Yeah, I did.
We saw the Saturday one at the World War II veterans event. We weren't able to go to the Sunday one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I thought you went to Sunday also.
We weren't able to make that one. No, sir.
Well, you only saw tell you what, you weren't there. Were you there Saturday morning also?
Saturday, yes, sir.
Yes. Because I just got it recently in a YouTube video, the whole thing. Recorded YouTube video. So if you want it for any reason, write down your email
Yes,
address
sir.
before you leave, and I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
All you do is click on it, and it comes right up.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
So those two events, the Seder and Dachau, were the memorable things. And I just, and then in more recent years, starting maybe 12 years ago, up until then, I never talked about anything. I never told my wife, never told my children anything about my military experience. And just prior to the pandemic, the National Geographic, somehow, I can't explain at this point how, but one of the members of the roundtable contacted me, and he said that the National Geographic was going to Detroit, Michigan to film World War II veterans preparing for a TV program. So he works for Jeff Johnson. He was the one, well, you weren't there this past Saturday morning for Cy Goodman's presentation, but Jeff Johnson is going to be the new commander of this fall. He works for Cox Communications, so he has access to a lot of good information, pictures and whatnot. But anyhow, so I contacted National Geographic because he told me the date they were going to be in Detroit. And it was the day before our roundtable meeting, which in those days was on Thursdays. They were going to be in Detroit that Wednesday. So I spoke to whoever there, and I told them, I said, you're looking for World War II veterans. You ought to come to Atlanta, because we got quite a few World War II veterans available right here.
Right.
Yeah, we interviewed one that we...
So anyhow, he said they'd check on it and call me back. Well, the net result was they flew to Detroit, and they said they wanted to go to Detroit because, number one, well, I told them we had a Tuskegee Airman available here too. Gave them the name, and they found out that he was a ground crew member. In Detroit, they had a Tuskegee Airman that was a pilot. Plus, they had the use of the Ford Dearborn, Michigan plant for filming.
Cool.
So that result is they did their filming in Detroit. They took a flight that night from Detroit to Atlanta. The next morning they were here at the roundtable meeting. So anyhow, they selected about 6 of us for individual video interviews. Well, when they informed me, I made the cut. So I was on the program. And they allowed me not only to speak on TV program, but one statement that I made, they asked me, they told me they were going to use that statement to close the program, which they did. And I also have that on my computer.
They see it.
That interview or that program. But, and the phrase that they used, that my remark that they used was, I said, I hope and pray that every person that hears my voice of my experience and their offspring outlive the offspring of the deniers. And that's how they ended the program with that statement. Next question.
So did your experiences during the war affect your views like on the war, like the world today and current events like the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, of course, I'm anti-war because I know what it's like. And in my opinion, the last war that the United States was involved in that was non-political was World War II. I think every war since, starting with Korea, Vietnam, it's been a political war.
Because it didn't need to happen.
And that's not a good situation because it's just not going to end. You know, they thought the First World War was a war to end wars. The Second World War was definitely a war to end all wars. Well, it doesn't work out that way.
No.
And politics gets involved. It makes it even worse. So
I'm curious about some of the questions you have about being Jewish and also the impact.
Did your Judaism like affect your experiences during the war?
do what?
Like, did your Judaism and like your view on life, like because you're Jewish, like affect like your experiences during the war?
Not my Jewish outlook. I mean, we learned, of course, in later years about the Holocaust and all the. In fact, at the 50th, 1995, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau, my twin brother Howard went to Germany. I couldn't go at the time. I had business commitments that prevented me from going. Then I went with some family members, my wife and I, son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, to the 70th anniversary, which also was a momentous occasion. It's really, and when I got the invitation, it was all in German. I couldn't understand it, so fortunately I have a neighbor that was born in Germany in the last year of the war, I think. And so I took it over to her, and she wrote it all out in English for me. So I came home and I told my wife, I said, well, we're going to Germany. My wife says, we're not going to Germany. I said, well, you can decide whether you want to go or not, but I'm going.
I'm going.
Yeah.
And I said, because I'm not the only one that got an invitation. I'm sure they're going to have survivors, other liberators, and I want to hear their stories. I know mine, but I want to hear theirs. And so we went. Turned out to be great because it gave me the opportunity, especially to talk to some of the survivors. And as an example, every one of them I asked the same question. Where were you at? What were you doing early the morning of April 29th, 1945? And the most emotional one came over me. It was a Sunday morning. That Sunday morning, they had in Dachau itself today, they have 3 small buildings, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. And that Sunday morning, each one of those 3, they had a large tent attached to it, and they had a Sunday morning service. When one finished, the other one started, and so forth. So they picked us up from the hotel in Munich in a bus, along with others, brought us there, and every day it was a light rain. So when I got off the bus, they insisted on me sitting in a wheelchair because it was muddy, a lot of water puddles. So my son pushed me into the tent for the Jewish service to start. Well, when we came out of the service after it was over, which, by the way, you went in the tent, was one center aisle. The seats on both sides were all full. So my son, all he could do was park me in the aisle. And that was it. When it was over with, the speakers from the front and a few survivors that lit candles, they were coming out. Well, it was difficult for them to leave because everybody from the seats got into that one aisle. Suddenly I look up, and who's standing next to me but Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany.
Wow.
She's standing closer than you are right now.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So I look up and I recognize her. And so I just touched her on the arm. And I thanked her for her remarks. And she looked at me and she thanked me for liberating Germany.
Wow.
So that was a little contact then. But anyway, came out. I'm in the wheelchair. My son is pushing me. These 2 ladies come towards me. The middle-aged lady introduces the older lady as her mother, who was a survivor from Dachau. So I asked her the same question. Where were you at? What were you doing early in the morning, April 29th, 1945? She looked at me and she said, I was so ill with typhus. I didn't know what was going on inside the barracks or outside the barracks. Then she leaned over, she kissed me on both cheeks, and she said, if you guys were a couple of days later, I wouldn't have made it.
Wow.
Quite emotional for me at the time. The other survivors I spoke to, I asked the same question, and I got somewhat similar but somewhat different answers depending on which ones I talked to. In fact, one in particular, when I was in the wheelchair in the aisle and he was sitting right next to me, there was like a little rope separating the aisle from the seats. He was holding an Israeli flag. He had like a tree branch with an Israeli flag attached to it, and he carried that everywhere he went. He didn't want to talk. Okay. I figured maybe it was too painful for him to answer my question. Don't know. But the others did talk and told me, and I enjoyed
And these
it.
were mostly German citizens that had been confined in the concentration camp there. These were Germans, or they were German Jews. I mean, obviously, right?
Maybe he was German Jewish descent. I don't know. I know he was Jewish because he was in the Jewish facility for service.
Got it.
The only ones that were not Jewish on the left side was packed with cameramen, still cameramen, video cameramen from around the world. I'm sure they moved from Protestant to Catholic to Jewish, filming whatever.
But there was a mix there at that service of survivors, liberators, etc. And I was just saying that some of the survivors that were there were probably interned in those concentration camps.
Yeah, he was a survivor.
Right.
But anyhow, I said earlier, I never talked to my wife or children about my experiences until maybe 12 years ago when I was, before that, maybe a year before, I was invited, my brother Howard and I both were invited to the Holocaust Museum in Washington as liberators. There was a little over 100 liberators there from, not only from Dachau, but other camps, liberators of other camps. And had a very nice weekend ceremony event. And then I guess it was maybe a year later, we got an invitation to go to Poland for the International March of the Living. My brother Howard at the time was too ill. He couldn't go. But I went. My wife and I went, and my son and daughter-in-law. We made arrangements for them to join us. So the four of us went, and there again, it was a fabulous experience. Krakow, Auschwitz, and Birkenau. And since we were the group of 14 liberators from the U.S., we were treated like rock stars. Believe me, unbelievable. I remember in Krakow, one night they had a invitation-only event in the opera house. Standing room only. And they had us backstage. And then one by one, they had us walk out on stage and being introduced to the audience. And one by one, they introduced us again and gave us a medal. And it was just unbelievable. And then when we got to Auschwitz, after 3 days in Krakow, 3 or 4, and sightseeing, organized sightseeing around, and I was, myself was a liberator from Atlanta, so arranged for me, they bused me to Plaza in Krakow, where they had students from Jewish high school here sitting in front, and at Plaza, they have these steel chairs made out of steel, and they're all high. They're like high chairs. And here these students from Atlanta, most of them were from Weber, sitting there waiting for me, and I sat in the chair and answered all their questions. There again, another memorable experience. And then there they took us to Auschwitz. When we got to Auschwitz, they had the female lady in charge of Auschwitz give us a private guided tour. She took us into a few buildings that normally don't let tourists go into, but she took us in and gave us a good education of what we saw there. Then Birkenau. And Birkenau, you can't, without ever being there, you cannot imagine how large that camp was. I mean, when we entered, there was only 10,000 people in that march. And I wanted to walk. It's 1.9 miles, a little less than 2 miles from Auschwitz to Birkenau on a road. But my wife, my son, said they had about 6 golf carts there for the World War II veterans. So they said, get in that golf cart.
Right.
So I sat in the golf cart. So I rode that short distance. They walked. But, which was another experience. But when you got inside that camp through the gate, you could not see the outside gate to the left, and you could not see the outside. It was too far. It was huge.
Wow. And then to imagine how many people were there and what became of them, you know.
Well, that was another message that my wife and I couldn't go because we had to stay with the group for our particular bus. But the curator from Auschwitz, my son and daughter-in-law, had gotten a little friendly with her when we toured Auschwitz, so they hooked up with her at Birkenau. In the audience, they get front row seats. And she took them into some of the original barracks that were still there. And they went inside and took some pictures of those original barracks, and the original barracks were still there. Now, those barracks were built after Dachau, because Dachau was the original. I don't know how many years after, but it couldn't have been that many years after Dachau. Dachau, when my brother went there in 1995, all they had, which is there today, is 2 replica barracks. The rest is all concrete foundation of each barracks. I show that in my regular presentation, which was Sunday morning at the Jewish War Veterans. This Wednesday morning, Georgia Holocaust Commission makes arrangements if I need it. A member's picking me up at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, driving to Barnesville, Georgia, Lamar County High School, to make that my regular presentation to the Lamar County High School. Hour and a half to 2 hours drive, depending on traffic. And I show, there again, that's what I show, the aerial view. So you can see the prisoner camp and the huge SS German Army camp alongside, which controlled the prisoner camp. But so I could talk for hours and hours and hours going into all kind of detail.
Well, I'm wondering, Radley, if you have another one or two more questions that you can ask Mr. Margol
I have a few.
that are important to you. Yeah. Pick the top couple of questions you want to ask.
I'll pick out one.
All right.
Did you forge any lasting friendships from the war? Well, it just so happened, starting, I guess, maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years after the war, our division would have an annual reunion in a different city in the United States. Every year was a different city in the United States, a reunion. So my brother and I used to go to almost every one of them around the country. And of course, we renewed friendship with guys that was in our, and of course our officers, our captain, 3 lieutenants were just like one of us, and they were no longer superior officers.
Right.
And most of the time they would bring their wives. My wife would go most of the time. So we got acquainted with their wives. They got acquainted with our wives. I mean, you know, it was and one in particular, we look forward every year to meeting with him. He lived in Kansas City. And another one was from New Mexico, tall guy. And I remember at the first reunion that he brought his wife, and she was sitting next to me at the dinner. And I asked her, I said, by the way, how is your daughter Melissa? She said, how did you know we had a daughter Melissa? I said, because your daughter Melissa was born when your husband came in the military. You were pregnant. And your daughter Melissa was born when we were together in Oklahoma. And what your husband did, he took a cardboard box and he cut a hole, he sealed it up, and he cut a hole in the top and put a little sign on it, pennies for Melissa. And he told all the guys in the gun battery, anytime you got any change, just drop it in the box for Melissa. So he collected coins.
That's funny.
For his baby daughter, Melissa, that he hadn't seen and didn't see till after the war.
Wow.
But anyhow, so that's how I knew you had a daughter, Melissa.
That's neat.
Things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm the last one of the 100 men. The rest are all gone.
So it's quite a feat to live to 99 and be able to remember all these stories and tell all these tales.
Well, fortunately, I got my mother's genes. She lived to 102. My twin brother Howard got some of our father's genes, although he lived to just before our 93rd birthday, he passed. As we used to say in the division, he went over the rainbow just before our 93rd birthday. But he had all kind of medical problems, all kind of surgeries that my father had some of them. My father had his first major heart attack, and he had his second and last heart attack, when he was 68. And as the doctor said, he was gone before he hit the floor.
Wow.
So I got lucky, got my mother's genes.
What else, Radley? Maybe one or two more.
Oh yeah. What is the greatest lesson that you think the younger generations can take from World War II?
What was the greatest what?
What's the greatest lesson you think the younger generation can take away from World War II?
Well, number one, whatever faith you learn, keep it. Regardless of what happens, keep your faith. Because in difficult times, that's going to pull you through. I don't care whether it's Jewish, Catholic, whatever. But if you keep that faith, that's going to put, as the old saying is, there are no atheists in foxholes. You see. And even guys in my outfit that I was close to that didn't necessarily have a faith, they suddenly found God in combat.
Wow.
So I personally, as I told our rabbi some years ago, I never believed in a physical God, but I certainly believe in a spiritual God. because that's something that you can hang your hat on all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Makes sense. And what do you wish that the younger and that you already did the lesson that you think we can get from World War II, but what do you wish that we would learn or would learn from World War II?
What do you wish we would have learned
Yeah.
from the war?
wish we would have learned. Well, I guess I'll quote one of President Reagan's favorite remarks: "Trust but verify."
Mm-hmm.
In other words, dictators, there's always going to be some country that is governed by dictators, and you just can't trust them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you enter any kind of agreements with them, you can trust them but verify,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just not going to work. Democracy is the greatest thing for mankind. No question about it. There's too many, in history, there's too many countries that were ruled by Democrat society, Democrat leaders, to prove otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
That as far as human beings are concerned, because every dictatorship, even, hundreds of years ago, countries that were ruled by kings, there was always a segment of the population that was suffered.
Mm-hmm.
In other words,
Mm-hmm.
because of a single ruler. So it doesn't mean that even in a democracy like this country, there aren't people that suffer. But for the most part, there's a helping hand always available,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a next door neighbor or some government agency that's available to help. You don't find that in dictatorships.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a last question, maybe? If you don't, I maybe do.
Do you?
Well, I'm curious if there's a question you wish that Radley had asked you, and if so, what's the question and how would you answer it?
Offhand, I can't think of it.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe you have one more thing.
I would say that I'm honored that you selected me for your bar mitzvah project, but that's the question I would ask. How come?
So my mom, I had the idea that I could interview Jewish World War II veterans and document their experiences, and I could put it into my project because it's not really a very traditional service. We don't have to read from the Torah or anything like that, but we do have to make a speech about something that interests us. We take a topic that interests us, make a project about it, and then we have to speak about how this helped us discover more about our Jewish identity, and it's pretty interesting. And
Well, and why did you? I'm curious why you got interested in World War II and why World War II veterans, particularly Jewish World War II veterans, was interesting to you.
I don't know. I was always pretty interested in it, but I read this really good book by this author named Alan Gratz. I've probably read it more than 30 times. I'm actually not
What's
sure.
the book by Alan
It's called
Gratz?
Allies.
Allies by Alan Gratz.
Yeah, it's a really good book, and it's young adult, historical fiction. So I saw it in the school library, and I was like, okay, why not read it?
What is the book about?
It's D-Day, so it's pretty interesting. But it's got a bunch of different perspectives, and it's a really cool book. Yeah.
Well, I commend you. I think you're going to go a long way in life.
Thank you.
So I don't know if you picked up all your smarts from your father, your mother, or from both of them,
Probably both.
but apparently you got them.
Thanks.
Just stick with it.
Great.
What synagogue do your family belong to?
We were members of